Thanks for listening to the STEM Factually podcast. I'm Dr. Marissa Civic. Today we're going to talk about how to assess the validity of STEM research articles. This topic's geared towards everyone, and I will include specific tips for general audiences as well as high school students, undergraduate or graduate students, and anyone who's asking questions that can only effectively and accurately be answered through a search of the scientific literature. For more information on STEM Factually, please see the links on our Spotify profile to check out social media, my website, and additional resources. I appreciate you listening and look forward to discussing this topic with you. Feedback is appreciated and questions are welcomed. So, there's a lot of information, especially at our fingertips now. We have our phones. We can look up anything we want at any time, and we are given a variety of resources that attempt to or pretend to answer our questions. And now with AI, we often don't even think to look at the source of the information that we're getting. Now you can search something and AI will give you a brief overview of an article and it answers whatever question you had. But how often do people actually look and see, well, what citations did this AI bot use when summarizing? So we're just, as the future progresses, we get more and more data thrown at us when we search a question, and it can be very difficult to assess quickly whether or not a resource is providing us with accurate and correct information. So honestly, the spread of misinformation is a crisis, and we really need to focus as individuals on how to find and assess legitimate resources that answer our questions. So some of the different types of resources I'm sure everyone has encountered: articles, AI, news stories, social media posts. And people don't often think of this as a resource, but people who act like they know what they're talking about, but they're not qualified to assess or teach the information that they've interpreted. So your friends that sound very confident and are telling you something, or a professor that's talking out of their field of study, a medical doctor that's talking about something they're not an expert in. There's information everywhere that can come from reliable sources, but not potentially be reliable. So it's really difficult, even as a professional like myself, who has experience with interpreting data, understanding data, researching data. I'm an expert in how to analyze the literature, how to read scientific articles, and it's still sometimes a task to go through an article and really analyze it and figure out if it's a legitimate research paper, if the results actually represent the claims that are being made or support the claims that are being made. It's difficult, and I'm hoping that I can help some people with this process, talking about the process, what we can do, what to look for in a valid article, and how to find information. And then this is part one of a 2-part episode. The second part will talk about how to actually read a research article, how to approach research, so that kind of thing. So part 1 talks about how to find it and how to determine if an article is reliable. Part 2 will delve into how do we break down an article, understand something we're not an expert in, and then get information out of it that answers our questions in a reliable and accurate way. All right, so let's get started with part 1. So how do we actually find reliable information and sort through all the information that's thrown at us? it's really difficult. You tend to need to have an idea of where to start. So it's not as simple as plugging a question into a search engine. You need to know what the reliable resources are so that you can search those reliable resources directly for your answers. Most of the time, we need to seek out research articles to support questions that we have about medical, like obviously talk to a doctor, but if you are looking up medical questions, it's never good to go to a blog or a social media platform or an influencer. You want to go to a research article and look up that information, and then that is what you would talk with your doctor about for your questions, you know. And it's the same thing with scientific questions or questions on major events such as climate change or vaccinations or COVID. We would want to go to reliable research studies and read those, not people that have necessarily just interpreted those studies for us. So you need to know where to look. And most of the time, the answer is research articles. And it can be really hard to access them and find them or even know what articles to what databases to use to search them if you're not a professional in the field. It's one of the it's a major problem with the scientific community in that a lot of information is paywalled and blocked from general society. And people argue that not everyone should have access to every article because they can't necessarily interpret it. But what about people that actually do have the capability to interpret it? For example, I lost access to all of the databases that I used to have when I left my career. And yeah, I'm fully capable of understanding the scientific literature. So I don't have access to those things in a straightforward and simple way. I need to apply for licenses. I need to request articles through the library. I need to go through all these different paths to get access to information that's actually beneficial to me. So by locking up all of this data, it's, in my opinion, not very useful to society. If what we're trying to do as scientists is contribute to society, more information should be available. But what's good is that there has been an open source movement in terms of journals having papers that are open access to the entire community. So hopefully, as we go forward, more information will be accessible as a whole to the general public. All right, so how do we know if a resource is reliable? We really need to develop a skill set and an approach to analyze resources. That's why we're here today. That's what we're going to talk about. So I'm going to start getting into that. And once we find the reliable resources, how do we really understand them without the proper background? And the summary of that is that we really need to break them down individually, take the time to understand them effectively, and what's something that's very important is to know your limitations as a reader. I think I really want people to feel comfortable reading a research article and feel like they can teach themselves that information. And it was something that I encouraged my students to do often is pick up a research article. This is how we approach it. This is how we understand it. But with experience with research comes sometimes overconfidence. So you need to still know your limitations. If you are not an expert in the field of the paper you're reading, then you won't 100% understand what's going on with that paper. You may miss nuance or limitations of the paper itself. There's bits and pieces of it. So once you've started to get a grasp on how to read research and how to understand scientific articles, just be aware that you may still have limitations in your understanding due to your background. It's the same with me. I'm an expert in chemistry and a specific niche of chemistry. I understand research articles across STEM, but I have to appreciate the fact that if I am reading a medical article or perhaps a biology focused article, that I am not a biologist and I am not a medical doctor. So I may understand the research, what they're trying to do, their practices. I may understand the mathematics that they use, the statistical analysis, their instrumentation, but I'm going to be missing the nuance of their field and potentially different limitations of their focus. I'm not familiar with other research in their field. So every individual has their own limitations. And I think it's very important to keep that in mind as you become more versed in scientific literature and how to approach it and understand it. Just be aware that you are potentially not an expert in every field you read. Therefore, you have your limitations as well. So when we do go to relay it, it's important to not be overconfident in what we're explaining. It's important to use phrases like, my understanding was from this that we can make this conclusion. My understanding from reading this paper was that we can go here because of this set of data. We don't say, oh, this paper definitely means this and we should change everything we do. That's not effective. You need to start thinking and talking like a professional in STEM if you're going to be sharing that information in a professional way. So, so that's kind of the summary of where we're going with all of this. All right, so let's delve into what is a reliable resource. A reliable resource is one that comes from a reliable source. By source, I mean a set of peer-reviewed journals. It's a source that's written by reliable professionals or organizations with a strong track record. You want sources that cite reliable resources and are written by someone that are capable of assessing their reliability. So these are all types of reliable resources. If you're not familiar with the term peer-reviewed, it means that an article was written and then peers in the scientific community, ideally without bias, so they don't know you directly, and they look at the articles before they're published. So they then give feedback to the authors, and then the author's paper is accepted for publication. So you're getting more than one set of eyes on the paper, which strengthens its validity. So a peer-reviewed journal is going to be any of the major journals. For chemistry, the American Chemical Society, the Royal Chemical Society, there's so many, Nature, Science, many different major journals. They're all peer-reviewed, and you go through a peer review process when you submit an article. For examples of sources written by reliable professionals or organizations with a strong track record, you're talking about reading like websites that are designed by hospitals and the articles are written by doctors to give you information, or college websites where the faculty have created pages to explain certain topics. There's many different resources for chemistry, for science, where colleges or universities will develop huge wikis or databases of information for students. Those are typically a reliable resource because they come from a reliable organization and are written by reliable professionals and usually edited as well by more than one set of eyes. So maybe grad students or someone like that takes a look at it before it gets submitted, or grads write it and professors check it type thing. And then for sources that cite reliable resources and are written by someone capable of assessing their reliability, that would be someone that is reading the paper and writing an editorial about it, or a news station, a news source such as like Science News or Nature News that comes from a professional organization and is written by someone who's familiar with the scientific literature, and they are a reliable person to then overview that and produce a synopsis of that for the general public. There's also some popular science type magazines and things like that where they cite reliable articles and then they talk about it in a way that the general public can understand better without a PhD in whatever the field is. Those types of resources are also reliable for basic general information. Would I cite one of those when I write a publication? Absolutely not. But if you're looking for quick information on a general science topic, they're a great resource. So some important factors to note: each source that you use needs to be individually analyzed for reliability. So you can't just assume that because you go to the top journal in chemistry and it's written by, it has strong authors and they're all from a top tier university. You can't just assume that that article is reliable because you've searched that before and that website's been great for articles. No, these are all written by individual faculty members. Graduate students sometimes write papers and submit them, and faculty have never read them. Sometimes peer reviewers just toss it to a grad, or they don't even read it, and then there's no revisions sent back. So it's every source individually that you utilize from the scientific literature needs to be examined every time you go to it. You can't just take a research article as ultimate truth. You need to assess every single thing you read for validity. It's exhausting, but it's necessary. And it's something that's interesting if you're a graduate student or an undergraduate. You've probably encountered situations like this where you're writing a publication or a report and you're trying to find different information, and you can never just go to one source as your go-to for everything. It takes days and sometimes weeks or months to just filter through all of the research that's out there and then assess each paper for its validity prior to reading the entire paper, breaking it down, trying to understand it, and then apply it to your own information. So it's a monumental task, and it often gets overlooked, and people take articles at face value, and you really can't do that. There's been a number of cases where there's been fraud, plagiarism, just lying about data, and it can come from very reliable resources. So it's important that we use our intuition and then also analyze everything we read. We go into it questioning whether or not the information is valid and approach it like a scientist. Look at the data, make your own conclusions, and then compare to the conclusions of the authors. So it takes a long time, and it's not simple, and it's something that is not an immediate skill. It's something that takes years and years to develop this type of skill, to do it effectively and correctly. So it's often a major part of the PhD process is how to just analyze literature and understand it, and then also figure out if it's reliable. And it's something that's often skipped when we're in a hurry because it takes a long time and it's hard. So ideally, we want to try to come up with ways to do this quickly so that we get better information than we were getting before when we're going to very general resources. All right, and I've already talked about knowing our limitations. It's important to know your limitations as a reader, especially when you're relaying the information that you have read. We don't want to read an article and then accidentally spread misinformation because we misunderstood something and didn't realize it. So question your own validity as a reliable resource as well. So how do we physically find resources? So there's many different ways you can go about it, but it's never simple unless you have access to tools through a university. Some libraries have access to search engines, but in my experience, the best search engines for searching the scientific literature are through university licenses, which is a shame. But if you are in a university, that's great. Go to your library website and see what you have access to, because there's so many great search engines for searching the literature. You can search by topic, by chemical structures, by reactions. Biggest thing I miss about being a part of an academic network is that I don't have access to those types of tools anymore for when I'm searching the literature. You can also search journals directly. So if you know that you have a question that's related to chemistry, you can look up a few chemistry journals and go directly to them for your answers, or a medical journal if you're looking for medical information. Another way you can do that is if you're, so this is mostly geared towards graduate students, undergrads, faculty members, or staff who have been studying something, a field, and they're very familiar. I automatically know what faculty to look up if I'm interested in a particular paper. I know, who's working on electron transfer. I know the top names in solar. I know, I know what faculty to look for. So if you are familiar with a field, you can start searching by author name and just look up what they've published and then see if the information you're looking for is in one of their papers. So as you become more familiar with a topic, you're able to go directly to faculty searches. And then another way that's good too is if you find one article that kind of talks about what you're interested in, you can look at the citations in that paper. Who do they cite? Because they definitely cite papers that are relevant to their paper. So you can search for one paper and then cut your search down to relevant articles by looking at their citations or who cited them. Every paper has a cited by section and you can click those. And then if you're more of a general listener and you're not a student or in academia or research or anything like that, a way that can be an effective way to search is if you find a website that's more general for information. So let's say you're at a hospital website and you're looking up some kind of medical information that you're curious about. And there's an article that is written by a doctor. It comes from a reliable hospital network informational website, such as Mayo Clinic or Cleveland Clinic. And you read the article, you see who they cite for their information. So they should have a citations page or little superscripts next to the words, and you can click those, and then it should link to reliable resources for that information. So if you're ever looking at a general site and you want to know more and delve into the scientific literature, then look at the citations of that website and then continue your validity analysis of those as well. So how do we obtain access to these articles once we find them? 90% of the time, a guesstimate here, you're going to hit an article that you can't read. And it's locked and it says, pay $30 or $100 and you can download it. There are ways to access these. So if you are in a university network, universities have access to almost every article that you can find. And if they don't, you can request access to it through the interlibrary loan system at most university libraries. I've done that multiple times, and it typically at the places I worked and went to college, it was a very quick turnaround. So I would request something and 24 hours later, I would get a copy of the article. So it's definitely worth doing. The general public can also request copies from libraries. Some libraries have an interlibrary loan system where you can request an article. And there's usually college universities in the library networks that will scan in the article and then send it to you through your local library. If you have questions about that, talk to your librarian or go to their website because every library is different. A great resource now, and it's becoming more and more popular, are open access journals. Most journals now major journals have at least one open access option. They can be a little difficult to find because there's many different open access options that may not look as though they're reliable resources at first glance. It's kind of a new thing in the last 5 years or so, maybe more. And you kind of have to look at impact factor of the journals and see how many citations they have, see who's publishing in them, see if they're peer reviewed. These things are all really important because for open access, you pay to get into those journals typically. So, they're not always representative of the entire academic community because there's a financial aspect there as well. So groups that don't have a lot of funding may be producing excellent research, but they can't necessarily get into an open access journal right off the bat. So it's not totally representative of the whole population, but they are available to the general public. So that's a huge plus. And they're great if you're just looking to scroll and read some articles or pick up a new topic or see what's popular in your field. So you can go to the different journal websites and try to find their, most often I go to reliable journals that I know are reliable, and I go to their open access journals and I read those and subscribe to their alerts so that I get up-to-date research information that I can actually read and have access to without having to request copies. If you do find an article that you can't get access to, a good tip as well is to search the article name in a web browser. Sometimes faculty will post PDFs of their papers, so it sometimes gets pulled up when you do an internet search, or students will post them. They just show up on college websites sometimes. So sometimes you can find a PDF download of an article that's behind a paywall, and that's in a legitimate way, not breaking any rules. And then you can also go to the authors, the corresponding authors, so the last author on the paper's faculty webpage, and sometimes they post links to PDFs of their papers as well. So if there's a paper you really want to read right away and it takes a minute to do an interlibrary loan request, you can try those couple of things as well to just see if you can get a copy before then. So once you find an article, what do we do? Where do we start to figure out if it's a valid article? So I do a first glance at the article that gives me a yes, I'm going to read this, or no, get rid of it, not worth my time. First, I look at the journal that it was published in. What is the impact factor? So if you haven't heard that term before, impact factor is a number that's ascribed to different journals, and the higher the number, the higher the impact. It's related to how many articles are published in it, and it's representative of, if it has a high impact factor, then it's probably a reliable journal, and there's a good chance it's peer reviewed, but you have to look at the way journals calculate their impact factor as well. You can't take that at face value. All these things that I say have to be put together to determine whether something's valid. It can't just be one thing that tells you that it's valid. It has to have everything or most things. So another thing to check with the journal is, like I mentioned, was it peer reviewed? Is the journal one that requires other experts in the field, but not in the research group of the author, to read the paper and then provide feedback to the author, who then has to provide revisions? So that's an important factor. If it's not peer reviewed, only one faculty member potentially has looked at that and published it. And that person could have competing interests and publish something that's not legitimate. So it's a concern if the article isn't peer reviewed. Something else to look at on your first glance through the article is, when was it published? Is this paper 100 years old? Or is it something that was published in the last 10 years, 5 years, year? How relevant the date is really depends on what you're looking at. If you're looking at studies on medical information, then you're going to really need something recent, because medical information changes every single day. If you're looking for efficiency of solar devices, well, in the last 6 months, they've changed efficiencies drastically. So you need to have very recent data in order to assess how efficient the current perovskite solar cell is. So if you're looking for something that can be older, then that can, be further out. So you really need to look at the date and then think about what kind of information you're looking for, and then assess if this is a good representative set of data for your question. Another thing to look at is the author list and the affiliations. There's some red flags for papers if there's, for example, you have 10 authors on a short research study it implies that, it may not be a reliable resource. Why did 10 people get put on this paper? It doesn't make sense. It's just little red flags that you're like, interesting. I wonder if this is a really strong resource or not. Let's see. And then who the author's affiliated with. It's tricky, right? Because even the top tier universities have had major cases of fraud. So you can't always say, oh, this is a paper from a top tier university. It has to be reliable. I've peer reviewed articles from top tier universities that I was surprised at what was submitted. So you can't always trust that a top tier university is going to produce a top tier paper that's 100% reliable. But you do want to make sure that the affiliation is an accredited university. It's coming from a group that has active research data. They're graduating grad students, and this isn't just a random publication for them, that they're experts in this particular field. And those little bits of supporting data imply that this paper is going to be more reliable if it's a strong author, a strong affiliation from an accredited university. Then something else that's important to look at is if everything above that looks good, go and look at their citations list. The citations list is quite telling because there's interesting information in there. You can see who did they cite, how many papers did they cite, are they citing current research or are they citing very old research? If they're citing papers, relevant papers that are strong papers and pass our validity examination, then there's a good chance that this paper it's also just adding to the deck when we're looking at how valid a resource is. It has many citations, so they did their research. They cited relevant citations, so they read the papers and they know the field and they know who to cite. And then they're citing recent data and recent publications. So it's showing that this research is kind of cutting edge and more applicable to read if you're interested in very recent modern data. Something to check as well is the number of self-citations. The citation count can be increased drastically if a group is citing their own papers, and it lowers, obviously they have to cite if they mention information from previous works, but if they have 30 citations and 15 of them are their own citations, then that's not really as valid of a resource anymore as compared to one that cites 100 papers and has 4 or 5 self-citations. So it's something to look at. And then another thing to look at is the cited by section. So the citations list is who the author cited when they were writing their paper. The cited by section is a list of authors that are now citing this paper. And that's very useful information. If a paper is published and it has many citations, it means that it was, and those citations are written by, they're reliable resources and we've examined them, then it implies that the paper has merit and that it's contributed to the scientific community in a way that other groups can build off what they've done. So it means that it's more likely reliable if multiple other papers are citing it and now basing research off what they did or relating their research to what they did. Now, obviously, if the papers that are citing it are refuting their claims, then that's a different type of cited by, and it wouldn't be a valid paper any longer. If, for example, they published and said some claim and then 5 papers cited it and say that they can't confirm that claim, then that would be information against its validity. Something to look at as well are the number of revisions to the paper. Sometimes that can be interesting. You will sometimes see papers that are have revisions that have been attached to the paper, so it's a more recent version, and sometimes how they change the paper can be telling. It's not necessarily a sign that the paper's an unreliable resource if it has revisions, but I do like to see what the revisions are because it may change the way I view the rest of the paper. So that's kind of the gist of it. Look at the journal. Where was it published? What's the impact factor of the journal? Is it peer reviewed? Look at the date that the article was published. Is it a recent article? Do we need a recent article for the questions that we're asking? Who wrote the paper? Is the author reliable? Who is the author affiliated with? Do they have any competing interests? Do they work for a business that's publishing or collaborate with a business that's making profit off of their results? Things to think about, right? Because that creates a bias. Is it an accredited university that the publisher, that the author works for? These are all factors to consider. And then telling locations to look as well are the citations list. Do they have a number of reliable citations that they've cited while writing this article? And the cited by section. Were they cited in multiple locations so that they've contributed, they've contributed intellectual merit to the scientific community in a way that that information can now be utilized to support other studies. So these are all things. If it passes all these, then there's a good chance that this is a reliable article and we need to delve deeper and read it. So I do want to talk briefly about that before I end part one. Once you've assessed the validity of the paper, you really need to read the paper. And then there's a number of things you need to look at when you're reading the paper to assess whether or not the paper is a valid resource. So I'm going to talk about that and then in brief, and then I'm going to end part one and I'll talk more about it in part two because it's getting a little long and I don't want to lose listeners just because it's too much information all at once. So I'll talk about this briefly. So once you've assessed the validity, it passes the first glance. Let's delve deeper. So let's talk about the parts of a paper. Some of you will know this, some of you won't. So I'm just going to give a brief background on what each part of the paper is. And first, the paper starts with an abstract. That's a part that's always available and you can always read it whether the paper's behind a paywall or not. It's often what I think people who write news articles might just read because they often lack a lot of the important information within the paper, but you'll see that they pulled phrases and conclusions from the abstract. The goal of the abstract is to give an overview of what the paper is about, its goals, its focus. It introduces sometimes major results just in a very brief way. And then it talks about the generalized conclusions that were made from that result. So when you write an abstract, it's about a paragraph long and it's really like the to the point summary facts of what you got out of that paper. Like represents the whole paper in a really concise way. And it's a great way to get a feel for whether or not the information within the article is relevant to what your interest is. So a good place to start is always the abstract. The next section, every journal does these differently. Every author does these differently. Some people we'll switch the order. I'm going to just talk about them in the article. That's most commonly what I see, but don't expect every paper to have this exact order. So the introduction is exactly what it's called, an introduction to the background that you need to understand what's coming forward. So it often talks about a little bit of a history of the project. It gives a scientific background to any niche topics that not everyone would know in the field of study. And then it talks about what other people have done in terms of research that have kind of laid the groundwork for the paper. It's usually a very interesting read. It sets the groundwork for understanding the importance of the rest of the paper, and it starts to give you an idea of what you may need to look into more if you want to understand the scope of the article better. Then the next section is materials and methods, or sometimes it's called experimental, sometimes it's just called methods. But basically, this section just talks about what they did experimentally, what materials they used, what instrumentation they used. It's kind of a documentation for anyone who wanted to be able to reproduce the research data. These are the instruments you would need, these are the tools you would need, the chemicals you would need, etc., so that you can then repeat the experiment. And it should be inclusive enough that someone can read it and reproduce it. That's very important. Often there aren't details in there. Anybody who's tried to reproduce a synthesis from a materials and methods section knows exactly what I'm talking about. They don't always put in the most important details. It's very important when you read them to know the limitations of an experimental section, and when you write your own papers to actually do a good job at it so that your data is reproducible. The results and discussion are sometimes split. It depends. Sometimes you'll have a results section and sometimes a separate discussion. Sometimes they pair them together. It's usually author discretion. Sometimes journals set forth what needs to be done. Results will talk about exactly what it says, the results. It reports the data in tables, and then the discussion would then, or figures, and the discussion would then talk about the data. If they're tied together, you get kind of a hybrid where here's the result and here's what it means. Here's the result, here's what it means. The results and discussions are a really important part of the article, and it contains the most information and the most extrapolation of the data. So it's where you're most likely to find your answers when you're reading a paper looking for answers. The conclusion section is about a paragraph long, and it's kind of just what the authors want you to take home from the data. And then they also usually incorporate in conclusions where this data is going, what we need to explore more. They'll mention some limitations periodically. The conclusions is sometimes people skip it, and I think it's important to read it because it kind of just summarizes everything and tells you where they could go. And if you're ever like an undergraduate student or a grad and you're trying to come up with different ideas for research or ways, you have to write a report on a topic, conclusions is actually a wealth of information because they set up a new set of experiments that haven't been done. They talk about what more could be explored. So it's always an interesting area to look at if you're kind of looking for ideas of what kind of research to do, what kind of report to write, what's new in the field and what needs to be done still. Then there's the acknowledgement section. That's brief, and it usually just says who contributed to the article. Sometimes it lists grants, things like that. The supporting information is usually open access on every article, and it's basically just a separate PDF of data that's relevant, but doesn't necessarily need to be in the article itself. The citation section or references will be the list of references that the article refers to. And then the cited by, I've already talked about these. It's any of the authors and publications that have cited the author post-publication. So it's a great place to look if you've read this and you enjoyed this paper and now you want more information or to see what came after this. All right, so I'm going to end part 1 here. Part 2 is going to discuss how to read each of those sections, both with and without a formal background in the field. It's an interesting episode as well, so please tune in for both if you find them relevant, and enjoy. Thanks for listening. Please follow us on Spotify for more educational resources, or on our social media platforms. Questions and feedback are always appreciated, and you can submit questions on my website or message me on social media. Thanks again for listening. This has been another STEM Factually episode. I'm Dr. Marissa Civic, and I hope you tune in for part 2.